I'm not a full diploma candidate. I was in Vermont for a spring semester. But I love it.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we're very pleased to be hosting Seth Rockman, who's here to talk about his new book, Plantation Goods, a material history of American slavery. Seth's an associate professor of history at Brown University, where his area of particular historical interest has been the period between the American Revolution and the Civil War. His work has sought to understand better the relationship between slavery and capitalism, and his previous two works focused on that. One book he authored was Scraping By, Wage Labor, Slavery, and Survival in Early Baltimore. Another he co-edited was Slavery's Capitalism, A New History of American Economic Development. In his new book, Seth explores a fascinating aspect of the slave economy in the 19th century, namely clothing, tools, and other goods made for use on southern plantations. Now, I'm sure you've heard the phrase that's favored by police and investigative journalists, follow the money. Well, Seth follows the things. In this case, an array of items such as shoes and hats, shovels, hoes, and more that were produced in the North for use in the South. Because slaveholders in the South lacked the interest or the capacity to manufacture these supplies, they outsourced the production, preferring to focus instead on producing agricultural commodities. Seth follows the trail of these textiles and tools from their manufacturer in northern communities through the merchants and marketers who distributed them, and then into the hands of southern slaves who used them. This system made producers and distributors in the North remote stakeholders in the South's regime of human bondage, a fact that, as Seth writes, tended to blur the line between where slavery existed and where it stopped. Indeed, Seth's book is only the latest in a growing body of contemporary scholarship recognizing slavery as a geographically unbounded institution and highlighting the North's complicity in it. Seth says the purpose of his book isn't to offer more examples of Northern complicity, but more to learn how it was lived and experienced in all its complex interlocking relationships. He's definitely succeeded in that. The book's extensively researched and lucidly written, and it helps deepen our understanding of slavery's profound impact on American society. In conversation with Seth will be Michael Ralph, who chairs the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University and is founding director there of the Center for an Equitable Economy and Sustainable Society. An anthropologist by training, Michael, like Seth, has researched slavery, but his focus has been on such issues as debt, insurance, forensics, and incarceration. He's the author of a book out just last month called Before 13th, which is a graphic novel about the practice of convict leasing. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Seth Rockman and Michael Ralph. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad, for that very thoughtful introduction, detailed introduction. It's an honor to be here with you, Seth, and to be in conversation with you about your fascinating and important book. Thank you for joining us this evening.
No, this is a wonderful treat. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight under the strange circumstances in which we find ourselves this evening. I'm looking forward to being in conversation with my friend and colleague Michael, but also in just creating some sense of community and to share this moment with you. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. I think that's a great place to begin, actually. Obviously, we're talking about enslavement, and the predicament of enslavement is really the predicament of stolen people on stolen land. So obviously, we want to kind of pay acknowledgement to being on the unceded territories of the Anacostia peoples, and also just thinking about what it means to tell this story with a lot of care. And so I guess I want to begin there, Seth. You kind of open with a note about language that you'll use and language that people could obviously find offensive or upsetting. And so I wondered if you could just start by telling us why it was so important for you to open with that note about language.
Sure. Well, so for scholars working on the history of slavery in the Atlantic world, there's a lot of recognition that the kind of source material that we use, produced primarily by enslavers, is simply an archive of anti-Blackness, that the very assumptions of human beings as commodities, as things, is so baked into the language of everyday discussion, including words like slave, right? Or words like master, which cede a huge amount of ideological terrain to the people who claimed illegitimately to own other human beings. And so as a scholar seeking not to amplify or intensify the ongoing violence of that language, it's important to think of ways of alerting readers to the kinds of choices we make in a book like this. So to say, I could quote a number of 19th century sources that use the N-word repeatedly, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to bring that violence into this space for my readers, even as I want my readers to recognize that the kind of business that is documented in this book is one that is very much invested in those categories and in that language. So I wrote this piece simply to say that some of the language in this book might be alarming. Some of the language in this book might seem anachronistic. Some of the language in this book might be different than what people expect. But the goal overall is to make it very clear that this is a book that can't escape the anti-Blackness of 19th century American culture and life. And yet, in seeking to tell the stories of the people involved in it, it has no desire to reproduce that language.
Thank you. I think that's well put. So now I wouldn't suggest for a second that people could judge this book by its cover, but the cover is really interesting. So could you tell us about what appears on the cover and why you chose this cover? And those of you just joining us, feel free to come in their seats. Don't be shy.
Thank you. So yeah, it's a very fabric-y cover, which makes me happy. Just sort of an interesting thing that many people don't necessarily know is that book jackets, book covers, authors don't usually get that much say in this business, right? These are decisions made by marketing people who have a sense of what would sell and what wouldn't sell. And there was actually a little bit concern that a book that had this much fabric on it might seem, well, I mean, I'll be very blunt, feminine. And in this way might not appeal to the kinds of readers who typically buy serious works of history. I know. So I'm very pleased to know that we got around that. And in a book that is primarily about women's textile labor, it seemed, in fact, incredibly important to document what that looked like. So what you see on the cover are various remnants of textiles produced in the American North that would be marketed to the Plantation South and ultimately used by enslaved people. And this is a strange aspect of the archive that I was able to use to do this work, because slave clothing is not something that is well preserved. And actually, at some point, when Lonnie Bunch was doing the collecting for the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, was asked what would be the ideal thing that you would like to find for the collection. And he said, everyday work clothing, and we're never going to find it. And it's true, because it was, of course, used into oblivion and repurposed into smaller and smaller fragments, into rags, into patches, and ultimately evaporated, and of course was not deemed worth collecting. But what survived were small 2x2 squares that were often affixed to letters traveling between northern manufacturers and potential southern customers, or from southern customers to New England manufacturers saying, can you make this? Or I would like 5,000 yards of something approximating this. And these textile samples are abundant in the archives, and they became a key source for me in this book, including doing some textile reconstruction, trying to figure out things about the weave structure, about the fiber content, and about the ways in which these kinds of textiles would have had specific performance qualities that would shape the work of a New England farm girl on her loom, and also shape the work of a Mississippi woman in a row of a cotton field.
Yeah. So how good is your weaving game? Can you tell us about your own expertise? I mean, one thing I asked because one thing I like about your work, your first book and this book as well, is you pay a lot of attention to ingenuity and sort of the skills and expertise people cultivate. So I'm curious about if you managed to develop weaving game in the process of writing it.
Yeah, I would not boast of being a particularly successful weaver, I'm sorry to say. But it is something that did figure into my research method. I did think it would be important in writing about textiles to have some sense of what it was to work on a barn loom, to think about the kinds of decisions that someone would be making, facing down 1,000 warp ends, and tasked with making 50 yards in a day, and the trade-offs between quality and quantity. And so I had the good fortune to use some of the records of this New England manufacturing company at a historic weaving school in Vermont, where I brought these records and said, could we make these? And they said, absolutely, but you're gonna have to learn how to weave. And because I had no textile experience, they had to say everything, all the kinds of tacit knowledge that an 8-year-old girl in 1826 would have known. Obviously, I had no idea about, including things when you're winding a warp for weaving. There's an important move called picking a cross, and people are like, "Well, obviously you know how to make a cat's cradle." Like, no, actually, I don't. And I was mocked at that point. And what were you doing in elementary school? I was like, collecting baseball cards, not making cat's cradles. So a lot of stuff really had to be made, had to be articulated about how this worked. And that's really been a crucial part of my sort of method as a historian. I am very interested in sort of maker's knowledge, in the kinds of expertise that is rarely articulated, rarely written down, but that would be passed from mother to daughter or from father to son, and that would be part of craft and artisanal traditions, and recognizing that that work is knowledge work. That work is skilled work and labor that has often been devalued in our society and called unskilled. It's very important for me to recognize that all work is skilled in the sense that it requires various kinds of expertise. And I wanted to reproduce that or gather that into this book. And so the discussions of New England women's weaving, for example, or the discussions of enslaved seamstresses and the kind of choices they had to make in cutting cloth in order to make clothing that would meet their daily production quotas, trying to figure out what the sort of knowledge that's involved in that would be is something that figures prominently in the book.
Yeah, I think that's a point you make in your first book as well. And Scraping By, you talk about scenarios where like an enslaved person with an artisanal skill set would escape from slavery or something and be replaced by a newly arrived immigrant. So you kind of show that there's like a porous boundary between slavery and freedom, and that even enslaved people could be tremendously skilled and tremendously important for certain industries. But I'm curious, given that, like, where did this book come from? Sort of where did the idea come from, or sort of at what point did you think you were going to write a book about sort of what you're calling plantation goods?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So you're right, I'm a labor historian, and I've written a lot about work at the intersection of slavery and wage labor. And that was the basis of the book that I wrote about Baltimore. And when it came time to write another book, I was interested in trying to do something more national, but also to take on some questions that were much more urgent at that moment in time. Questions about, say, the place of slavery in American life. And when you think about the kinds of controversies that emerged in the middle of the 20-teens around a new body of scholarship that was arguing that slavery was the driving engine of American economic development, or to look just more recently at the kind of firestorm that Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 project elicited within public life. It was clear that there were there was a lot at stake in making claims about where slavery mattered and where it didn't. And in trying to enter that kind of discussion, it seemed like we could argue about sort of slavery and capitalism in the abstract, but it would be much more useful to concretize it, to make it tangible. And I knew that there were a series of New England communities where virtually every family was involved in making shoes or making hats or weaving goods that would end up being sold to the South. And I started by looking into those communities and figuring out sort of what production looked like in those spaces. And once I realized that there was a huge amount of material there, I was able to follow those goods to the South. This is one of the surprises about this book. So as someone who's interested in the experience of slavery in the US South, or as a scholar interested in that, one would not necessarily think to travel to the Rhode Island Historical Society or the Massachusetts Historical Society or to other archives in New England. But it turns out that the business records of these firms are some of the richest repositories of material pertaining to the day-to-day experiences of enslaved people thousands of miles away. So if you're a business that is making textiles for the Southern market, specializing in woolens, and your business records have been preserved, it may be that there are 1,500 letters from slaveholders, from Southern merchants, from traveling salesmen, and others coming into New England saying things like, we spoke to the people on Colonel Jones's farm and they were profoundly dissatisfied with last year's kerseys. Can you make it woven tighter this year? And also the women insist it be dyed red. And you're like, wow, I've never seen something like that. And to think about the kinds of conversations that make enslaved people critical consumers of these goods and give them a stake in the design process allowed me to use this New England archive to tell new stories, I think, about plantation slavery itself.
Yeah, so I think people might be surprised to hear you talk about enslaved people as critical, as consumers, as involved in the design process. And you open the book with kind of a scene where there are enslaved people who kind of confront certain producers or manufacturers of the cloth they'll be wearing, or they have very strong stakes and arguments about what it means to be dressed the way they're dressed and that kind of thing. Could you say a bit about sort of what made you open that way and what was at stake in that sort of confrontation?
Yeah, so the book really does open in an episode that I was very surprised to find. And it's an episode that takes place in a Charleston store in Christmas 1825. And it involves a group of enslaved men who are held captive about 50 miles away, but who come to the city to confront the local merchant and the New England manufacturer, who are both in this shop, about the terrible, terrible quality of the goods that they had been issued just several months before. They'd received their winter clothing probably in October, and by December it was already sort of shredded. And they were quite unhappy about this. And of course, the person who claimed to own them was very unhappy about this too, because he'd invested a lot of money in outfitting these people, because keeping them dressed was crucial to his vision of himself as benevolent, but also crucial to his desire to exploit their labor in the fields in order to produce ever more cotton or ever more rice, and to protect the investments in their bodies by protecting their health through clothing. So in that space, right, you have a slaveholder, you have a group of slaves, you have a Charleston merchant, and you have a New England manufacturer basically debating the qualities of a particular kind of textile that in 19th century parlance was referred to as Negro cloth. And this was not a specific fabric. Many fabrics could fall under that umbrella. What defined it as such was its expectation that enslaved people would be wearing it. And as they go back and forth and talk about whether last year's goods were better than this year's goods, or whether fabrics that were twill woven were better than fabrics that were plain woven, or whether fabrics that were all wool were better than fabrics that had cotton warps and woolen wefts, back and forth, back and forth. Basically, this group of slaves turns to the New England manufacturer and says, white man not ought to make this at all. And it's like, wow, that's a kind of remarkable moment. And it's the kind of moment that we don't see in the archive very often. And I wanted to use that to set up this idea that enslaved people are not simply passively being given goods and unquestionably simply putting on those fabrics, but that in fact enslaved people had all sorts of interventions in this business, whether as serving as basically product testers, right? A New England manufacturer might send out a bunch of axes to a plantation in South Carolina and ask for feedback. And all of a sudden you get these letters coming back to New England saying, you know, on this plantation, 3 men used these axes and they reported that the weight in the back, the pole of the axe was too heavy, and the blade was beveled at the wrong angle, and the way in which it was attached to the handle certainly wouldn't last for more than a few weeks. And all of a sudden, right, that information comes back into Northern production. And so the lives and rhythms of a New England axe maker or an employee at an axe factory has something to do with the kinds of preferences that enslaved people are expressing in those spaces. And if you've continued to follow the correspondence of New England manufacturers talking to Southern merchants and Southern slaveholders, right, the language that shows up repeatedly, and this was also quite surprising to me, was, my people are dissatisfied. And that language, right, we could of course say, well, you know, they're ventriloquizing their slaves. They're simply making a claim, perhaps playing on some kind of presumed philanthropic aspiration of a Northern manufacturer who doesn't want to leave any people dissatisfied. But to think about what the term dissatisfied might connote in a society that is basically a powder keg, and in which violence is ever present, and in which the resistive violence of the enslaved is the primary anxiety of slaveholders. To talk about dissatisfaction is to introduce questions of what it means to have 200 angry people because the cloth you've gave them hasn't lasted to Christmas. And by being able to introduce notions of satisfaction or dissatisfaction, I argue that enslaved people are in fact participating in a kind of politics that doesn't have them bought off by better cloth, or doesn't ever put them in a position of accepting the legitimacy of slavery because of better material conditions, but rather by engaging in this kind of critique and engaging in this kind of dialogue about the goods themselves, they're able to basically contest the terms of their labor and to challenge the kind of hegemony and pretension of slaveholders, particularly around the system's, what slaveholders would call its benevolence, which is obviously not there.
Yeah, I think the idea of enslaved people as active in the design process and even in, I guess, what today is called like user experience of these products or objects is very interesting. But I think that one thing that's clear especially when you think about enslavement in a range of industries, right? Not just picking cotton on a plantation, but like, as you noted, like logging, like wood cutting, cobblers, blacksmiths. These enslaved people who, let's say, were rented out to different industries, their owners were well aware that those enslaved people had skills that they didn't have, you know? And so in a sense, it does make sense that they would have insights about the products because they also had skills and expertise that owners didn't have, you know? And so in a way, they could use those products in a different way at a higher level and put it to a broader range of uses than even their owners could. But I'm wondering, could you talk about the specific goods you focus on? Because you said refer to them in passing, but when you say like plantation goods, you have in mind at least 3 distinct kinds of objects that are kind of the focus of your story. So could you share more about that?
Yeah, thank you. I'm mostly so this category of plantation goods is a 19th century term, and you see it in advertisements, and it would be legible to New England manufacturers, to Southern merchants, and to enslaved people themselves, right? The basic materials that are required to provision a plantation and to facilitate the exploitation of labor there. So that involves hats and other clothing. It involves shoes and boots. It involves agricultural tools like shovels and axes. And ultimately, as I devote a little bit of attention to, it also involves whips the crucial violent apparatus that is at the heart of labor exploitation, many of which are in fact imported from places like New Jersey, giving Newark, New Jersey a reputation as the whip-making capital of the United States. And one of the things I try to do by focusing on these goods is actually to think about their kind of material qualities, right? To think in terms of ergonomics, for example, of a handle and the ways in which different handles have different implications for how people work, or to think about the design of shoes and the ways in which shoes that, for instance, might not have a differentiated left and a right, or that might have a particular kind of sole, have implications for people's ability to move through space or not to move through space, or to think about different kinds of textiles and the ways in which these textiles have performance qualities. So that actually it is very important that wool, which seems like a particularly violent addition to the slaveholders' repertoire, dressing people in very hot places in wool, actually has the ability through use and mixing with sweat to felt and to become soft. It also has a greater give and durability than cotton, and it also wicks moisture off of bodies so that for people who are working in the rain or who are working early in the morning, there's some notion that in fact this is a very desirable textile rather than 100% cotton goods. And so by thinking about sort of the materiality, the ergonomics, the performance qualities of these goods, it allows me to think in new ways about basically what work is on the plantation and what the bodily experience of enslavement is based on what it means to work in shoes that don't fit, or that shoes that don't have an arch, or in jackets that have far too narrow armholes and far too short sleeves, and the ways in which this is not just sort of a decorative aspect of the system, but rather this has real consequences in people's ability to meet work quotas and to avoid the kind of violence that is ever present on the plantation to extract ever more labor.
Yeah, I think you're touching on the important sort of relationship between, I guess, design, labor, productivity, and then even style or fashion. Because obviously, certain groups of workers become known for being dressed a certain way or dressing a certain way, even though at some level how they're dressed is related to the function and expectations of their labor. So I think that's something we see all throughout time in different ways. Um, I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions and answers, but I did want to say a bit or ask you a bit about this idea you mentioned, as Brad noted in the introduction, that you sort of follow the objects, but in a way, I think your process also shows the tension between like the infrastructure and the structure of the economic relationships and the objects. Like for instance, you talk about the crucial role of debt and being in debt by the different manufacturers and how that showed when and how products were produced, when and how products were shipped, how they were dealing with responses to the design of the products given their own expectations about when they make payments. Could you say a bit about just how the payment structure related to how they circulated objects and things like that?
Yeah. So the book is set up, again, as Brad had mentioned, sort of following the things. So it begins in New England communities with stories of New England entrepreneurs who are basically thinking, if I could make an indestructible hoe, I could be a millionaire. And thus devoting sort of the best energies of New England's Industrial Revolution to the production of these kinds of goods. And then a couple chapters on New England workers who are at the center of making these goods, women at the loom, men at iron forges, producing these tools, and thinking about the ways in which their encounter with industrialization is mediated through making particular goods, not generic goods for abstract markets, but specific goods for a segment of the American population that was largely reviled in the American North, and the ways in which the relationship of New England workers to Black people generally, to enslaved people specifically, and to abolition could in fact change the way in which they thought about earning wages or accepting the discipline of a factory. On the other side of the book, chapters on slaveholders and the kinds of fantasies they have about these goods as they give them out, what they want from them, how they incorporate them into schemes of discipline and dominance. And then finally, 2 chapters on enslaved people and the ways in which enslaved people incorporate these goods into their strategies of resistance, into their politics, into their sartorial expression, and so forth. But in the middle, there are a couple chapters about what happens as these goods move from point A to point B, about the goods in transit. And this is really sort of the crucial space for figuring out the linkages of North and South in this period, because the goods don't get there themselves. And so you end up with a whole sort of mercantile network of people who have a stake in wholesaling these goods, perhaps through New York City or perhaps through Charleston, into the hands of smaller wholesalers who might be in Mobile or in Selma, to even smaller retailers who might be at a crossroads store somewhere in the middle of Alabama, and the ways in which almost all of the transactions that put these goods into the hands or onto the feet or onto the backs of enslaved people are negotiated through credit. And credit, right, with its time lag, with its notion that you will be repaid later, has huge implications for a business in which these goods are, of course, used up in the process of generating the money that will ultimately be paid back. And it creates some very interesting and surprising connections, and also some quite remarkable moments. So let's say that you are a New England company that is making textiles for the plantation market, and you sell to a slaveholder in Louisiana 500 yards of cloth. And the slaveholder has basically said, right, I'll pay you 8 months from now the $300 I owe you. 8 months go by, the money hasn't come back to New England. A letter comes back to New England. Dear Mr. Hazard, the name of the Rhode Island manufacturer, as you know, I owe you $300. Last year's cotton crop was completely decimated. We weren't able to make that kind of money. I would very much appreciate an extension of credit for another 6 months. Alternatively, if you need to be paid right away, I can take Mary to New Orleans. Now think about that for a second, right? If you want to be paid, you have to basically pull the trigger on a slave sale. And at a moment in which Northerners who may be very indifferent to emancipation, but who are increasingly sensitized to the slave trade as the unique horror of enslavement, being the person who institutes a slave trade is a place where Southern purchasers, Southern customers actually have some leverage over their Northern suppliers, because the answer back is almost like, please don't. Have another 8 months, have another 12 months, but we don't want to be involved in that business. But that is not always the case, and it becomes the case through credit and through bankruptcy, where if you are a creditor and your customer goes bankrupt, you are entitled to some percentage of their assets in order to be repaid. It means that a significant number of Northern manufacturers at some point become the legal owners of enslaved people or of plantations, and that creates a whole different kind of moral relationship to this business than would otherwise be present if it was just like, oh, I make shoes and they're shoes for enslaved people. And frankly, if I didn't, the slaves would go barefoot and that would be worse. So I'm not skimming profit off of a corrupt system. I'm actually engaged in philanthropy. I'm actually engaged in benevolence, which is one of the ways that many of these Northern businesses come to think of themselves, as actually doing good in making slavery less bad by providing plantations with their essential material infrastructure. But once you come to that moment of slave sale, then all of a sudden it's a very different calculus.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to underscore how even people who see themselves as having different motivations wind up in the same kind of commercial scenario or commercial operation, or even different parties to the same transaction. And that's probably a good note to sort of open it up to the audience. We'd love your questions, thoughts, comments, maybe even critiques. I'll start in the back and then come here.
Well, I think they'd like you to use it.
Oh yeah, if you don't mind, use the microphone, please. All right.
That's okay. So, did the New England manufacturers also cater to, say, farmers in Illinois who own their own land, and did they have different products for them? And to me, this just seems like sort of the rules of trade, where it's domestic trade, but it's, let's call it international trade for the purposes of the United States, where they're shopping their products around, and they're just engaged in this trade function. And because enslaved people are free, if you will, by their labor is free to the owner of the plantation. Those owners don't need to invest in manufacturing facilities, et cetera. Whereas labor, in the North or in the Midwest, you have to pay them, so that it creates an incentive for higher value goods.
So this business is very much predicated on the idea that slaveholders, in making decisions about how to allocate enslaved people's labor, would rather have that labor put towards the production of agricultural commodities that can be sold in world markets. And it is, in fact, in their economic interest to devote, say, women's labor to picking cotton rather than to weaving, especially because weaving can be bought far more cheaply in places like New England. And so what I talk about in this book is the way in which New England basically becomes the site to which Southern plantations outsource a lot of their infrastructural needs. But in turn, a lot of small communities in New England, a lot of entrepreneurs in New England, come to see plantation markets as a uniquely desirable outlet for their goods. After all, the slave population is growing. After all, there are customs that pretty much dictate annual or semi-annual distribution of goods. It's a very predictable and regularized kind of market, and it's also a market where low-grade goods that can be made with particularly low-skilled labor can be vended, right? If you were a New England manufacturer who said, well, I've got a bunch of farmers in my neighborhood who I can provide yarn to and they can weave it on their looms, the kind of weaving that they would probably end up doing would not find a market among middle-class consumers in Philadelphia. It would find a market among working people somewhere else. And for some of these New England manufacturers, through mercantile networks that tie them or to kinfolk or to members of their community who've migrated south, they have direct kind of connections to a Charleston, to a Mobile, to a New Orleans. And that's obviously where they go. But the person who's in the next town over, in the next Rhode Island town, in the next Connecticut town, may have a kinsman who's in Cincinnati. And the next town over may have a kinsman who is in what would become Minnesota. And those places start making goods for those markets. So in many ways, there is nothing unique about the goods that are being produced for plantation markets, but they are vended as such as being especially designed for enslaved people to use. But the very same cloth that is going to be marketed in Charleston as Negro cloth may be marketed in Ohio for farming families, may be marketed in California for gold miners. And when the Civil War happens, many of these New England textile manufacturers who have made their wealth producing textiles for the plantation markets come to take contracts from the US government and put those very same looms and those very same fabrics to the purpose of making Union Army uniforms.
Thank you. And if you don't mind sort of introducing yourself as well when you ask a question.
Thank you for a very clear and informative discussion to both of you, and especially for the book and its cover. If I can phrase this question well, I hope you'll find it acceptable. I've begun to attend a church here in downtown DC at 16th and Mass, which today is considered a very liberal, if not progressive, on the LGBTQ community, reproductive rights, climate change, environmental justice, anti-poverty, and even multicultural and multiracial. But fortunately, just recently, a lot of very young people have come into the church, which is changing the balance of the congregation. And recently, they found out that the original minister, 150 years ago, more like 175, the original minister and many members had slaves. And the young people want to challenge the church to do some kind of confession or recognition about this. In fact, they would like to see an official and public apology. They're getting some resistance from the older constituency who was saying, wait a minute, everybody had slaves at that time. A lot of church people had slaves. A lot of pastors had slaves. Or they say the minister was really a good person. He helped to find a university. So what's the problem? In fact, the clergy who had the slaves a few years before he retired sold his slaves. So that's another definition of plantation good. My question is, why is it, what would you say to the people who resist this, and why is it important for the church to be forthright about it?
I would certainly say to the people who are resisting this that they should get over themselves. I mean, first and foremost, that recognizing the embeddedness of slavery in American life is crucial, I think, to creating a future that is ripe with social justice and inclusion. And the way we reach that point, it seems to me, is by telling a truthful and full history. And certainly at this point, as so many institutions, whether we're talking about universities like Georgetown, or my own university, Brown, or whether we're talking about private corporations like the former Wachovia Bank or JP Morgan or Citibank, have been asked to account for predecessor firms or predecessor institutions' decisions. And it creates all sorts of interesting questions about who can issue that kind of apology, what the nature of that apology is, whether that apology is meaningful without any other kinds of restitution or gestures towards restorative justice. And of course, there's a vast literature and a vast amount of public debate across institutions about what would create some kind of restorative justice. Your congregation would not have to reinvent the wheel, but the people who are in your congregation might very well learn about the range of things that have taken place within the Episcopalian Church, within institutions like Georgetown, within other kinds of entities, to figure out how this past can be accounted for and owned up to.
Yes, I'd love to. I would just say, okay, if given that some founders of your church held slaves, if even those enslaved people were worth a few tens of $1,000s in the 19th century, that could be worth a few $1,000,000 or a few tens of millions of dollars today. Now, if they're saying they don't want anything to do with it, I'd love them to calculate the value of that asset in today's terms. Let's say it turns out to be $10 million. If they say they don't want anything to do with that history, that's not who they are, then let them bring the $10 million and do something else with it. That would be a way of separating themselves from that history. But to the extent that they're not separate from that history and that their family has benefited from those assets over time, then they are accountable for how they earn that revenue, right? So I think if they truly want to separate themselves from it, they can do it. I know there's plenty of people who are descendants of slavery who'd want to share in that legacy in that way, right? But apparently they've benefited from it, and they wouldn't separate themselves from the financial benefit. They just seemingly wanted to separate themselves from the accountability, and I don't think it works that way.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I came.
Thank you for your question.
So I'm sorry to change the focus a little bit, but I'm curious about the textiles. I'm from Massachusetts, and my father grew up behind the store in a very small, down on its luck mill town. Hudson, Massachusetts, 10,000 people, probably hit its peak around 1890, and then went downhill. And there were looming brick, empty mills all over next to each little stream. And I'm curious to know what you're talking, I guess, about the early 19th century, what the textile situation was then. Was this piecework that women were doing on their looms at home, or had they already started to have textile factories, which are very interesting, with big looms? And what did a loom look like back then? I mean, there have been looms around since the days of the Odyssey.
That's right.
Penelope, weaves and then unweaves her loom at night. So that she won't be finished until Odysseus comes home.
No, this is exactly right. So if you are a New England entrepreneur in, say, 1820, and you have a ton of money, you might build a mechanized factory that would bring the process of spinning fiber into yarn and then putting yarn into looms, power looms, weaving it, having machinery for fulling and processing the cloth, packing it up and distributing it and send it off.
In 1826.
My point is, if you had a lot of money, you could do that. And the people who, for instance, invested in the mills in Lowell
Right.
did that. They brought the entire process under one roof. This was exceptional. Across New England, the vast majority of textile production in the 1820s, even into the 1830s, combined aspects of mechanization with aspects of handwork. So, for example, especially if you were basically had less capital and were looking to produce low-grade goods that could be sold to distant markets, you might contract with a mill to spin yarn. You might then distribute that yarn to farming families who would complete it on hand looms. You might come back a month later and pick up 200 yards from them, bring it back to your factory where you also had machinery for fulling the fabric, and from there you might send it out. Virtually all of the goods that are produced for plantation markets that I study in this book are goods that combine some aspects of mechanized production and some aspects of hand production. And where it gets particularly interesting is in the middle of the 1830s when a particular Rhode Island firm chooses to go into ready-made clothing production for plantation markets. They get a tip that in New Orleans in particular, slaveholders will be more than happy to buy fully sewn dresses, fully sewn jackets, fully sewn pants, which makes enslaved people some of the first Americans behind sailors and soldiers and prisoners to wear clothing that someone else has made who lives thousands of miles away who they don't know. And that ready-made clothing manufacturer means that some farm woman in southern Rhode Island is sitting there stitching 6 dresses a day by her fire, and those 6 dresses will end up for 6 women who are on a Louisiana plantation.
And when in all this was the cotton gin?
Well, so the cotton gin is a 1790s phenomenon.
Okay.
But yeah, there's a lot happening on the textile side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. I'm Peyton Garcia. I'm a sophomore honors economics major at Howard University, part of the Humanities Social Sciences Scholars Program, and a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow under Dr. Michael Roth. So as an economics student, I'm very interested in sort of the market that was taking place at the time in terms of Northern state manufacturing, in terms of sort of boostering and glorifying the efficiency of southern states and their ability to sort of produce resources themselves that were raw and then could be in turn manufactured and sent back. And so I was kind of interested in sort of like the advertising and the marketing that northern states specifically in the plantation goods that you were talking about, even in the manual labor items, maybe for male enslaved people, or even like some of the, I don't know if there are any items that were specific for like servitude within the house versus the field. So even knowing that there were some enslaved people that were specifically meant to work indoors versus outdoors. So even like, manufacturing hats and knowing that a certain amount of hats would be for the field enslaved people versus like certain dresses or gowns that would be worn for the enslaved people in the house specifically to serve dinner. So how did they sort of advertise that and ensure that Southern buyers would want to buy from people in northern states manufacturing for them, even though the values were kind of different, as you were saying?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. So the biggest hub of the plantation goods market is New York City. Now, that may seem strange because why would that be the case? It's because New York City is the leading cotton export site in the United States, right? It's New York boats who carry cotton from New Orleans to Liverpool. It's New York insurers who put the insurance on those cargoes. It's the New York banks that have the remittances from the British textile manufacturers who are the leading consumers of slave-grown cotton. So as a result, if you are a Southern merchant or a Southern slaveholder, the place you have money to spend more than any place else is New York City. And as a result, New York City ends up with entire wholesale districts that are designed towards specializing in agricultural implements or in low-grade textiles or in guns or safes or locks or any number of other tools and goods that you might need. And there are guidebooks that are set up for Southern merchants for their annual shopping trip to New York that list all the merchants in New York City and what they have. There are advertisements in the leading Southern journals and magazines that slaveholders would read, touting the qualities of various kinds of cloths or various kinds of tools. And the New England manufacturers become good enough that they can begin to advertise by brand name. So you'll see we have Collins axes, we have Scoville hoes, we have Hazard cloths. And so already by the 1830s and 1840s, there's a very legible kind of branding that's taking place here as well.
If you don't mind, I'm sorry. I just had one more question.
Yeah.
I was also interested in sort of understanding, like, even the absolute advantage that northern states had in manufacturing a lot of these goods. Did southern states feel any threats or pressure? Did they make any sort of amends to try to, leverage some of this advantage towards themselves, even knowing now from your own words that some of the exports and the profits made from the cotton that you're talking about were then also taking place in northern states? Like, did they feel any threat to southern economy? I know that that was also something that was very pertinent to them during the Civil War, understanding that they may be an advantage afterwards because they'll have to rely on northern states to take care of themselves. But did they sort of, what actions or even anything at all took place to sort of protect their own well-being and say, okay, even if we're not getting manufacturing from other states, we can still provide our enslaved people with these instruments that they need to work?
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter on that in this book. So I'm very happy that you asked that question.
Yeah.
So as people may remember from the most boring moments in high school history, all this debate in the 1820s and 1830s about tariffs and Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun and nullification, all of that discussion is fundamentally about who's going to dress the slaves. Is it going to be weavers in Wales and Scotland and England, or is it going to be weavers in New England? And when tariffs are put on, which brings the price of imported goods up, Southerners in the late 1820s and 1830s get very worked up about this. And we can nullify this legislation. And we have to show those Northerners that they can't push us around and they can't steal our money. We need to start building factories. And every time there's a debate about tariffs and tariff legislation becomes before Congress, or every time the price of cotton drops, you'll see white Southerners, white politicians and capitalists begin to demand building more factories. And they have all these kind of schemes. We can put poor white people to work here, and this will make them less volatile. They can share in the wealth of the slave system. For some slaveholders, we can put enslaved people to work in these kinds of factories, and this will be very, very lucrative for us. And then the price of cotton will go up, and all of the sort of resources will be reallocated towards plantations and cotton production. And so Southern industrialization is an ever-going process. It gets nowhere other than to create a discourse for Southern slaveholders about we're the slaves of the North and we're being exploited. And there's a whole sort of proto-Confederate dimension to this that builds into what we would see as the Southern nationalism that accounts for secession.
Thank you. That was very interesting.
The way that you've told this story, it's very people-centric. Those specific moments, those clear names. As you delve into the historical record. My question is, this is obviously a labor of love. What's one anecdote or moment that just didn't make it into the book, but you really wish it had?
Gosh, Hugh, you have stumped me. And I do want to acknowledge Hugh as a former Brown undergraduate who was one of the several students who helped me with research along the way.
I was lucky enough to be part of that.
Well, that's very kind. I don't know. I think I packed everything into this book, to be honest. I think I squeezed every ounce of everything out of it. So I actually can't think of something that truly ended up on the cutting room floor that I didn't get to talk about.
Could you tell us, related to this, tell us about what you've been thinking about these days and contemplating exploring next, maybe?
Goodness. Also a difficult question. Actually, so what I've been thinking about these days actually is not so much like what a next historical study might be, but actually thinking about what some of the implications of this study might be for our contemporary lives. And in some ways, right, this is a book fundamentally about the relationship of consumers and producers across space and the ways in which lives and livelihoods are entangled of people who lead radically different lives under radically different regimes of labor, but who are tied together through having different relationships to a specific thing. And in the era of the carbon footprint, in the era of fair trade coffee, in the era of the sweatshop-free sweatshirt, right, we are all very much part of those kinds of conversations. We, I think, in the contemporary moment, spend a good deal of time trying to decide what is ethical consumption under capitalism, trying to decide whether we can make decisions in our everyday lives that don't cause harm to people living thousands of miles away. And as these questions come to, say, rile our campuses as we talk about endowments and what it means to have clean hands around various things, what I want this book to do in some ways is to have us recognize that we are not the first to confront these questions of what it means to be tied to people thousands of miles away through our economic lives, and to recognize that people in the past have struggled with these kinds of things, and that in many ways this is like the hallmark or central experience of Western modernity to some extent. And by recognizing that our own struggles are embedded in longer historical struggles, I don't know that the people in the past had answers that we can immediately deploy, but I do find it somewhat of a consolation to know that we are not the first on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you
No, thank you. I think we have time for maybe these last two questions. Sure.
So my question is, where do you see, actually it's kind of a two-parter, apologies. Where do you see this book fitting into the discussion that historians are having about this period now in 2024? And where did you envision it fitting into that conversation when you first started imagining this book in the, I think, late aughts?
Thank you. And by the way, let me introduce Jeff Martin, another former Brown undergraduate who was involved in this work in the late aughts. So, you know, that's how long I've been working on it. People who I knew as 19-year-olds are now full-fledged grown-ups.
I have a lot less hair than I did.
Yes,
back then.
it's very alarming. Well, look, you know, there's been a lot of research about how important slavery was to the American economy. And a lot of economists have argued, well, you know, if we use this data, it was only worth 6.3% of Northern GDP. And I look at that and say, well, is that a lot or a little? If it were 4.7 or 8.9, would we think differently about the moral implications of this, or about the stories we want to tell about what lives looked like in the United States? And so as those debates in the 20-teens became increasingly intense around quantification, I very quickly decided I did not want to get involved in producing more data that would simply create some number that we could then disagree about whether it mattered or didn't. So I pivoted in this book to thinking much more about lived experience. And in that notion that this trade was ubiquitous, and this trade shaped lives in New England and shaped lives in Louisiana. And by talking about what those lives look like, I thought this was a better way of generating sort of what historians can do, which is to ask how people in the past made sense of their worlds. So to mention the part that Brad had mentioned in the introduction, it's not so much I have evidence of complicity of the North. Of course, the book is 100% about the complicity of the North, but that's not interesting. We don't need to have the smoking gun that proves it. Aha! Let's just assume that this is there. It's always there, and complicity is always there for all of us all the time. So the question is, how do we make sense of it? How do we live with it? How do we see some things and make choices or not choices to not see other things? And to that extent, the book is very much simply about this set of possibilities of kind of the cultural meaning making around a complicity that is inevitable and always there.
Thank you.
I think related to that question, there's also a way to think about it, to your point, Seth, about like, you know, GDP is one way to think about economic value, but another way to think about it is that if it's impossible to imagine that industry without slavery, right? If you're saying that the cloth, like enslaved people were central to the way this cloth industry took place, and we could say something similar about carpentry, railroad work, steamboats, cobblers, blacksmiths, carpenters, you know, even drivers and clerks in parts of the South. So if the work they're doing is essential to the function of the industry, that would seem to be a huge economic role, even if it's not the same as sort of how someone else would quantify GDP, you know, it seems to me. All right, our last question, please.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I just graduated from William & Mary, and I'm now an archives technician at the National Archives. So my question has to do with archival violence. You take such a people-centric approach. So my question is, how did you pore over so many manuscripts to find these, enslaved people's names are so hard to find, things that were never transcribed? When were you able to find nothing? And how were you able to find what you did find?
Yeah. Well, the solution to all of our problems is time. So when you spend 15 years working on a book, you can actually visit, 25 repositories and spend a lot of time looking. I think this kind of research actually is only viable with time. But this is also where I think this New England archive turned out to be really quite remarkable, because among the things that come into the New England archive are orders from Southern slaveholders that list 50, 100 people by name, but not only by name, but by height, by inseam, by chest measurement, by arm length, with some expectation that Northern seamstresses might be making made-to-measure clothing for enslaved people. They did not receive made-to-measure clothing. They received standard-sized clothing. But these kinds of lists became the starting point, because then I could find the records of those plantations by, say, visiting a repository in Louisiana or visiting a repository in Mississippi and match these things up. And what this allowed me to do, I'm this close to being able to say, a Southern Rhode Island woman named Dorcas Babcock on this week in 1836 made a dress that would have been worn for a woman named Mary on the Ricketts plantation in Louisiana. I can get that dress to the plantation. I can get a dress to someone named Mary, but I can't get the exact dress that Mrs. Babcock has made onto Mary, but very close, which is kind of a remarkable thing when we think about lives that are often assumed to be so disparate and so remote from one another, but that are bound together in this very intimate way through a dress that four hands have then touched.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess I would say it's a great question about archival violence and sort of what the archive can't do or can't tell us, but also I think that answer proves that there are many more stories to be told, and partly depends on how you conceptualize the archive, or if you're gathering new data and sort of creating new ways to explore new questions. So thank you, as you've done with this book.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone to coming out tonight. I really do appreciate it, and I'm just delighted to be able to put this book into your hands after 15 years.